12 feet beneath the downtown Seattle sidewalk, where the commuters cross at the corner of First Avenue South and Yesler Way, there is a whole street. Not a pipe, not a vault, not a basement. A city street, with a curb and storefronts and the doorways people walked through back when this was the ground. You stand on it through small squares of glass set into the pavement, about the size of a deck of cards, gone a soft violet now, the color of an old bruise. I have stood on that corner at 8 in the morning with a coffee going cold in my hand, watching 100 people cross, and not one of them looked down. There is no reason they should. But under their shoes is a doorway with the hinges still in it, and a shop front facing a sidewalk that the city of 1889 paved and then buried on purpose. The glass is not decoration, it was a skylight. Someone set it into the sidewalk on purpose 130 years ago so that daylight could reach the level below, the level that used to be the top. I want to be careful about how I say this because the lane I work in is full of people who would tell you the city was buried by a flood or a reset or some hand that wanted the old world hidden. That is not what happened here. What happened here is in the public record, filed and ordained and argued over in council minutes you can read today. The strange part is not that it was hidden. The strange part is that it was done in the open, by engineers and a city council, for a reason that had almost nothing to do with the thing everyone remembers. And the proof of it is still down there, where the daylight comes through the violet glass. Here is the part of the story everyone knows, because it is the part that makes a clean headline. On the 6th of June, 1889, a glue pot boiled over in a cabinet shop on Front Street, which is First Avenue now. The fire caught the wood shavings. It was a dry afternoon, and the water mains were wood, and the pressure was low, and by the time it stopped, most of the commercial core of Seattle was gone. The figures you'll see range from 25 city blocks to 64 acres, and I'll be honest, the sources don't fully agree on the count, so I hold it loosely. Somewhere in that range, the heart of the young city burned to the mud. By most accounts, no one died in the fire itself, which would be one of the few mercies in the whole affair, though the records of who was hurt and how are thinner than the records of what burned. The city was timber. After the fire, it would not be. So far, this is an ordinary story. City burns, city rebuilds in brick and stone, city is better for it. That is the story on the plaque. That is the story I believed for years. It is wrong, or rather it is half of one floor of a building that has two, because the city did not simply rebuild. The city rebuilt, and then it raised the streets up over the rebuilding by a full story in places, by more than that in others, and it left the first rebuilding standing underneath. The brick storefronts that went up in the 1890 boom were built on the old ground, at the old level, with their doors opening onto the old sidewalks. And within a few years of their doors being hung, the city brought in fill and timber and raised the roadway and the new sidewalks up past the tops of their ground floor windows. The merchants who had just spent their insurance money on a fine new brick front watched the street climb up the outside of their buildings until the front door was a cellar door. That is the anomaly you can already see from the road today. You do not need a tour or a guide or a permit. Walk the west side of Pioneer Square and look at the older brick buildings, the ones from the 1890s, and look at where the sidewalk meets them. The architecture tells on itself. There are windows at ankle height that have the proportions of shop front windows, because that is what they were. There are arched openings, filled in now with newer brick, sitting half a story below the modern walk, and the new brick is a different color, and once you have seen the seam, you cannot stop seeing it. The doorway is still there. It is just that the doorway now opens onto the underside of the street. I learned to read this the slow way, the way I read most things, which is to say I had the plat in one hand and I was looking at the wrong wall. Survey citations and ordnance numbers in this video are as filed in the city record. The descriptions of what is visible on the ground are from walks I have done in Pioneer Square, dated where I name the date. The first time I went down into the level below, I went as a tourist, because that is the only legal way in for most of it now, and I spent the whole hour not listening to the guide, because I was counting bricks in a wall that should not have existed. What stopped me was a doorway. A real one, full height, the kind a man would walk through carrying a sack of flour. It had a transom over it, that little window above a door that lets light into a back room. The transom glass was gone. The frame was still set true, and it opened onto nothing now, onto a packed earth passage that had been the public sidewalk of First Avenue in 1890, with the cast iron columns of the storefront still standing along it, holding up a ceiling that had been the open sky. Someone had hung that door to be the front door of a business. Someone had measured the transom and ordered the glass. And within a year or two of the work, the city had sealed the sky over it with the new street, and the door had become a thing you reach by descending. The official survey, the one that tells you where the grade is, says the ground of First Avenue South is where the modern sidewalk is. Stand on the violet glass, and that is true. The ground is under your feet. But the ground was also once 12 feet down, and the proof of where it was is not an argument or a theory. It is a doorframe with the hinges still in it. Where the printed grade and the standing doorframe disagree, I follow the doorframe. I have been down there more than once now, in different years, and the thing I keep coming back to is not the engineering, though we will get to the engineering, and it is stranger than the fire. The thing I keep coming back to is the violet glass. Up at street level it is a curiosity, a thing tourists photograph and step on. Down below it is a ceiling full of small bright squares, and on a clear day the light comes through them the colour of weak wine, falling onto a sidewalk that no one has swept in living memory. The glass was put there so the lower level would not be a tomb. For a while it worked. People used the lower level for years after the streets went up. Then they stopped, and I want to tell you why they stopped, because that part is not on the plaque either. But before any of that, before the glass and the doorframe and the merchants on their ladders, there is the question the whole thing hangs on. Not why the city burned. Cities burn. The question is why a city that had just rebuilt itself, brick by expensive brick, would turn around and bury the work it had paid for. The fire is the reason on the plaque. The fire is not the reason. The reason is older than the fire, and it had to do with what the tide did, twice a day, to the bottom of the new city. Open a tide table for Elliott Bay and look at the spread. Puget Sound runs a big tide, more than 11 feet between low and high on the strong days of the month, and a couple of feet more than that at the extreme tides. That number is the whole story. Hold on to it. Better than 11 feet, twice a day, every day, since long before there was a city to drown. The original commercial flat of Seattle was built low. It sat on a tongue of made ground and tide flat at the foot of the hills, and a good part of it was barely above the waterline at an ordinary high tide. In a timber town that was an inconvenience. In a town with plumbing, it was a catastrophe waiting for a calendar. Because the city had begun, in the 1880s, to install sewers, and the sewers ran by gravity downhill to the bay, which is the only way a sewer of that era ran. And twice a day the bay came up 11 feet and met the outfall and sent the gravity the other direction. I'll put it plainly, the way the period engineers were too polite to. At high tide, the toilets of the lower town did not drain. They returned. There are accounts, and I have read several, and they agree on the substance, even where they vary in the detail, of water closets on the flat that would, at the top of a spring tide, geyser. You learned the tide table, or you learned to regret it. Crapper's patents were new, and the fixtures were proud and modern, and they were plumbed into a system that the moon overruled twice a day. That is the reason, not the fire. The fire was the opportunity. The reason was the moon, and gravity, and a city built a few feet too low to argue with either. So, when the core burned in 1889, and the council had a clean slate of ash to work with, the engineers made the case they had been wanting to make for years. Raise the streets, raise them above the reach of the tide, so the sewers could run downhill to an outfall that the high water could not climb back up. Regrade the district. The fire did not cause the regrade. The fire removed the only thing standing in its way, which was the cost and chaos of doing it to an occupied, standing city. With the buildings gone, you could lift the grid before you put a city back on top of it. That was the plan as the engineers wanted it. That is not quite the plan as it happened, and the gap between the two is where the underground comes from. Here is the self-correction I owe you, because I had this wrong for a while and stated it wrong to people who trusted me to get it right. I used to say the merchants rebuilt and then the city raised the streets, as if the two were neatly in sequence, the buildings first and the streets second. It was messier than that. The council ordered the new buildings to be brick or stone. That part is firm. You can find the fireproofing ordinance in the record of the months after the fire. But the regrade ordinances, the ones that set the new and higher street levels, came through the council in pieces, street by street, and the dispute over how high to go and who would pay for the fill dragged on. The merchants could not afford to wait for the city to settle its argument. They had insurance money in hand and a burned-out lot and a livelihood on hold. So most of them rebuilt at once, at the old grade, on the old ground, because that was the ground that existed. And the city raised the streets afterward, around the buildings that were already up. That is the whole mechanism. The buildings went up at the level of 1889. The streets went up to the level the engineers wanted, a story higher in the years after. The two never matched and were never meant to in the end, and the space between them, the old sidewalk and the old shop fronts, with the new street arching over, is what people now pay to walk through with a flashlight. You can read the shape of the decision in the ordinance record if you have the patience for it, and I want to be honest that I do not have all of it. The regrade was authorized in stages, and I have read the ones I can find and not the ones I cannot. The Seattle City Council acted as the regulating body. The grade was reset by ordinance, the way grades always are, with a city engineer's profile attached showing the old line and the new line, and the new line floating a story above the old in the worst of the low district. The retaining walls went up along the street edges first, hollow stone and brick walls flanking each roadway. Then fill went in between them, behind the walls, against the fronts of the new buildings, and over the old sidewalks. The roadway was paved on top of the fill, and the sidewalk, the new public sidewalk, was carried across on a sort of vault, an arched or beamed deck spanning from the building line to the curb, with the old sidewalk left intact in the dark underneath. Which raises a practical problem the engineers had not solved and the merchants had to live with. And this is the human part, the part I find I think about more than the tide tables. For a span of years, a merchant on the regraded streets had a building whose front door opened onto the old sidewalk, 12 or 15 feet below the new one. The new street ran past at the level of his second-floor windows. A customer coming along the new sidewalk could not walk into the shop. He had to climb down. The cities of that decade rigged ladders, then wooden stairs, then iron ones, down from the new sidewalk to the old, so that a man could descend to do his shopping and climb back up to go home. For a while, the second floor of every building quietly became the first floor, and the first floor became the basement, and the old front door at the bottom of the ladder kept its brass and its transom and its dignity and served a smaller and smaller trade. I keep one figure of a man in my head when I read this, and I'll admit he is half a composite, stitched from the kind of account that survives in a city directory and a property notice, rather than from one named diary. So take him as the type and not the named individual. A dry goods man. Rebuilt his store in the spring of the rebuild. Brick front, plate glass, a transom over the door, his name in the window. Spent everything he had pulled from the ashes on it. Hung the door. Opened. And then watched, over the following year, as the city he had bet on raised the street up the face of his investment, window by window, until the daylight came in only at the top, and his customers arrived by ladder, grumbling, fewer each season, and the fine plate glass window he had been so proud of looked out onto a wall of fill and a row of cast iron columns holding up what used to be the sky. He had done everything the council told him. Brick, not wood. Rebuilt fast, kept the district alive, paid his assessments. And the same council, doing the sensible engineering thing, the thing that finally beat the tide and let the sewers run, had quietly turned his front door into a cellar. There is no villain in that. I want to be clear, because the lane I work in loves a villain. There is no villain. There is a tide that came up 11 feet twice a day, and an engineer who solved it, and a merchant who paid for the solving without ever being asked, and a doorframe that is still down there with the hinges in it, at the bottom of the stairs the tourists take. The survey says the ground is at the top of the stairs. The doorframe says the ground was at the bottom. They are both telling the truth about different years. The merchants endured this for longer than you would think. The lower level did not die when the streets went up. People kept descending to it for the better part of 2 decades, and the violet glass kept the light coming, and the underground had its own foot traffic, its own trade, some of it the kind of trade a city is happier to keep below the sidewalk. What ended it was not the engineering and not the tide. What ended it was a fear that came up from the harbour in the first years of the new century, and a city health officer who decided the lower level was a danger, and an order that shut the descended doors for good. That is part of the walk, and the walk is where this stops being a record and starts being a thing you can see for yourself. The stairs down are narrow, and they smell of cold stone and old creosote. You go down maybe a dozen steps from the modern sidewalk, and the noise of the street drops away behind you the way it does when you step into a church, and then you are standing on it. The old sidewalk. The actual public walk of the lower town, brick and board and packed earth, running off into a brown dark with the cast iron columns marching along the curb line. Every column cast with a little flourish at the top because the man who poured it expected it to be seen in daylight. I first walked the lower level in '04. I have been back several times since, in different seasons and with different guides, and once, by an arrangement I won't go into, more or less alone for half an hour, which is the only way to really hear it. The place is different at every visit because the lighting changes and the parts that are open change, and I have not seen all of it, and I want to say plainly that no one I have spoken to has seen all of it, because a great deal of the underground is sealed off behind property lines and condemnation orders and simple structural danger. What is on the tour is a fraction. The rest is under the rest of the district, behind walls where the daylight does not come. But on the part you can walk, here is what stops people, and it stopped me, and I have watched it stop a dozen strangers since. You come around a column and there is a storefront. Not a ruin of one. A storefront. The recessed entry, the 2 display windows flanking the door, the bulkhead beneath the windows where a shopkeeper would have stacked his goods to the glass, the transom above. The glass is mostly gone, and the wood is grey, and the paint is a memory. But the shape of it is complete, and it is at eye level, because you are standing where the customer stood, on the sidewalk, looking at the shop the way a customer looked at it in 1891. And then you look up, because the light is wrong, and the ceiling 12 feet over your head is studded with small squares of glass, and the daylight is coming down through them the colour of weak wine, and you understand all at once, in your body and not just your notebook, that the ceiling is the street, that the squares of glass are the violet pavement you crossed on the way in, that the people up there, whose footsteps you can faintly hear, are walking on the roof of a shop, and the shop is looking up at them through 130 years of manganese-stained glass, waiting for a customer who descended for the last time before the First World War. That is the moment. That is the whole video standing in one place. The survey says you are in a basement under 1st Avenue South. The shopfront says you are on a sidewalk in front of a dry goods store. The glass says it is daytime up above. 3 documents, 3 different truths, and the only way to hold all 3 at once is to stand on the spot where they disagree and let the wine-coloured light fall on you. The merchant I told you about, the composite man with the transom and the plate glass, this is where his trade went. Down here. For years after the street climbed past his door, he kept the shop open at the bottom of the stairs, and so did his neighbours, and the lower level had a second life as a kind of shaded arcade, cooler in summer, lamplit, a little disreputable toward the edges. The respectable trade drifted up to the new street level as buildings added proper entrances at the new grade. What stayed below got cheaper and quieter, and in the corners furthest from the violet glass, less particular about the law. A city always grows a shadow where it builds a basement the size of a downtown. And then the harbour brought up the thing that closed it. In the first years of the 1900s, there was plague in the Pacific ports, bubonic plague, carried in the rats that came off the ships, and city after city on the coast went into a quiet panic about rats and the dark places rats live. Seattle's lower level was the largest dark place in the city. I have read that the underground was condemned for the public on sanitary grounds around 1907, and I'll hold the exact year a little loosely because the closure came, like the regrade, in pieces rather than in one clean stroke. An order here, a condemnation there, a building sealing its own stair to stop paying to light a level no one respectable would shop in. But the substance is firm. The reason the lower town went dark was rats and the fear of plague, layered on top of the fact that nobody needed it anymore now that the buildings had grown entrances at the top. The doors at the bottom of the stairs were boarded. The violet glass kept letting the light down onto an empty sidewalk. And the city above forgot, in the practical way cities forget, that it was walking on a roof. I am not the first to go down and read the walls, and I want to give the people who went before me their due, because the honest distribution of credit matters more than the dramatic version where I discovered it alone. A city surveyor in the 1950s left notes. The regrade profiles were still working documents then, because the retaining walls and the sidewalk vaults are city infrastructure, and somebody has always had to know where they are when a water main breaks. There was a graduate student in environmental history, I want to say around '08, who walked the open sections measuring ceiling heights against the old engineers' profiles, and found, as I later found, that the drop is not uniform. It is a story in some blocks and closer to 2 in others, exactly as the original grade dispute would predict, because the council never did agree on a single number, and the streets were raised to different heights on different blocks. And there was a regional reporter in the early 90s who went down to write a colour piece about the tour, and came back up having found a sealed brick arch behind a stack of tour prop crates that did not appear on the tour map, and wrote 2 careful paragraphs about it, and then, like a good reporter, declined to speculate. I have stood at that arch. I do not know where it goes. The bricks are newer than the wall around them, which tells you only that someone closed it, not when and not why, and I would rather tell you I don't know than make something up to fill the silence. The man most responsible for there being anything to walk at all is none of these. By the middle of the last century, the whole lower town was a derelict hazard, and Pioneer Square was scheduled, in the way these things are scheduled, to be cleared. Old districts on filled ground over a forgotten basement do not score well on a planner's sheet. What saved it, and I have checked this one carefully because it is the kind of origin story that gets prettied up, was a newspaper man who started running tours down into the underground in the mid-1960s, partly for the money and partly because he understood before the planners did that the thing under the sidewalk was worth more standing than cleared. The tours brought people, the people brought attention, the attention helped get the district protected. He is the reason the stairs are maintained and the columns are lit and you can stand on the old sidewalk at all. I am wary of single hero stories, and there were others in the preservation fight, a whole committee of them, but the through line runs through the man with the flashlight and the patter, and it is fair to say that without the tour, the violet glass would be over a filled-in void today, and this would be a video about a thing you used to be able to see. So let me tell you how to see it, because that is the part of the bargain I keep. This is a walk you can do. Go to Pioneer Square in downtown Seattle, to the blocks around First Avenue South and Yesler Way, the oldest corner of the city. You do not need to pay anyone to find the first evidence. It is on the surface. Walk the older brick buildings and find the windows set too low, the arched openings half sunk below the modern sidewalk and bricked shut with a brick of the wrong color, the seam in the masonry where the old front becomes the new fill. Look down at the sidewalk itself for the small squares of glass gone violet. They are skylights, and you are standing on a roof. To get below, the legal way for most of it is the tour, and I'd take it even knowing it's a tour, because the alternative is trespass into condemned and genuinely dangerous structure, and I am not going to tell you to do that. Go on a clear day if you want the violet light. On a grey Seattle afternoon, the glass is just dark squares and the magic of the ceiling is gone. And when you are down there, find a storefront that still has its transom and stand on the old sidewalk in front of it and look up at the glass and listen for the footsteps on the roof. That is the whole thing. The tide that came up 11 feet, the engineers who beat it, the merchant who paid for the beating with his front door, the rats that closed the doors he was left with, and the small violet squares that someone set into the sidewalk so the buried street would not be a tomb. It is all standing there in the dark, exactly where it was, and the only thing that has changed is which level we call the ground. Stand back from the whole thing for a moment and notice what won. The fire did not win. The city came back from the fire inside a year. The engineers won their argument. The sewers run downhill now, and the toilets of Pioneer Square do not answer the tide. The merchant lost his front door, but the city he rebuilt is still standing, and still busy, and still making money on the same lots. By every measure a council keeps, the regrade was a success, and it was. It beat the moon, which is no small thing to say about a public works project. And yet the part of it that was supposed to be temporary, the part nobody designed to last, is the part that lasted. The retaining walls were structure, they were meant to last. The new streets were structure, they were meant to last. The old sidewalk in the dark, the boarded shop fronts, the transom over the dry goods door, those were supposed to be a problem the city would eventually fill in and forget. The plan was always to backfill the void, to make the basement solid, to erase the in-between level so the ground would be ground all the way down. The city never finished doing it. It ran out of reasons and money, and the void was cheaper to leave than to fill, and so the thing meant to vanish is the thing that survived, while the new infrastructure that was meant to be permanent has been torn up and repaved a dozen times. That is the pattern I keep meeting in this work, in every district and basin and capped shaft I walk. The program is in a hurry. The ground is not. The program needs the problem solved by the end of the fiscal year and the residents moved by spring and the level made solid before the next election. The ground simply keeps the shape it was left in, indefinitely, for free, with no agenda, until somebody comes down the stairs with a flashlight and reads it. The official record is the most authoritative document we have, and I mean that. The ordinances are real, and I cite them. But the ordinance is a statement of intention. The ground is a statement of fact. Where they disagree, the disagreement is almost always the ground, quietly keeping a record the program wanted closed. So what is under the next foot of earth down there? Honestly, more of the same, and that is the answer that should interest you more than a mystery would. The open tour is a fraction of the buried level. The rest runs under the rest of the old low district, block after block of it, behind the property lines, sealed at the stairs, dark behind that newer brick arch I stood at and could not explain. Some of it is collapsed, some of it is flooded, because you do not beat a Puget Sound tide forever and groundwater finds the low places. Some of it is structurally sound and simply closed, a sidewalk and a row of shop fronts with the lamps off, waiting under somebody's parking garage. There is no chamber of wonders down there, and I would distrust anyone who promised you one. There is just more city, the 1890 city, complete and patient, with its curbs and its columns and its doors that open onto Phil, more of it than anyone alive has walked, mapped only in fragments, exactly where it was left. I have spent a lot of words in this lane being careful, and I want to keep being careful right to the end, because the careful